Now is the time for the negative conclusion. Turretin Fan, you have 10 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Okay. Well, as we've explored during the cross-examination section, many of the questions that I raised and answered during my constructive speech were answered the same way, with some qualifications perhaps, but many of the questions were answered the same way. The verse that Vatican I relies on in defining the dogma, the only verse mentioned in Session 4, Chapter 4, paragraphs 6 and 9, the only one alluded to, is Luke 22:32. And it doesn't mention papal infallibility. It doesn't mention exposition of the deposit of the faith. It doesn't go beyond promising that Peter's faith won't fail and that he'll be able to strengthen the brethren afterwards. And the apparent meaning from the context is that he'll protect them when Satan tries to sift them as wheat, as Satan tried to do with Peter. That doesn't have to do anything with dogma at all. It has to do with resisting temptations. And we saw that strengthening the faith in 1 Thessalonians 3 is something that even somebody like Timotheus could do, who wasn't an original apostle, who isn't one of the bishops of Rome. And consequently, we see that Luke 22:32 isn't actually able to support the doctrine of papal infallibility. Matthew 16:19 similarly can't support it. And we saw that this passage is used by Rome for a variety of different purposes. One of the purposes has to do sometimes with this doctrine, although actually Vatican I's official documents, the actual definition, alludes to Luke 22:32, not Matthew 16:19. But even that verse, Matthew 16:19, doesn't tell us either that Peter can define dogma. It just says that whatever he binds on earth will be bound in heaven. And it certainly doesn't say that this ability that he has is something that will be passed on to other people, or that it's something unique to him. It doesn't tell us very much at all that would be necessary to establish a doctrine of papal infallibility. Now, Mr. Albrecht acknowledged that papal infallibility is something that would have to have been drawn from the deposit of faith. It can't be made up out of thin air. But it's not in the Scriptures. Papal infallibility is not taught in Scripture. It's not taught by the fathers, not explicitly and not implicitly either. Even when we talked about Ignatius, who says great things about Rome and her record of good teaching, he doesn't say that they're incapable of teaching something wrong. And he doesn't even know of a Roman bishop, at least he doesn't name him in the letter. And so to say that he believes in papal infallibility is a huge stretch. And I think Mr. Albrecht was wise not to come out and say that he does teach it. Irenaeus also, he talks about the Roman Church, but Roman Church as one of many churches, and that it has some sort of preeminence. But when we can get into that particular passage, it's one of these interesting passages to discuss. But even in that passage, Irenaeus is talking about the Roman Church as distinct from other churches. He doesn't have the whole Roman model where Rome is the center point, and the Roman bishop is the head of the whole church. We might spend a lot more time discussing Cyprian and what he believed. And unfortunately, this wasn't really a debate on what Cyprian thought. But whatever nice things Cyprian said about the papacy, he didn't say that the papacy is infallible, nor did Jerome, nor did Augustine. And Cosa Finita Est is one of these famous things that Augustine didn't say. And whether or not it's a fair paraphrase is really a whole other debate. Again, going back through what Augustine actually interpreted Luke 22:32 to mean, which is exactly what we're saying today, he interpreted it to mean, for what else did the Lord procure for the Apostle Peter by his prayer for him, of which he said, I have prayed for you, Peter, that your faith fail not, then that God would preserve his faith, that it should not fail by giving way to temptation. So the strengthening that Peter is doing is strengthening with respect to faith not giving way to temptation. It is very important strengthening because the apostles and the disciples at that time, they're about to be scattered by persecution. And it's vitally important that they be strengthened. And it's vitally important that they have spiritual nourishment. But what's not necessary, and I'm glad that Mr. Albrecht conceded this at the end of the last cross-examination section, what's not necessary is papal infallibility. God doesn't need papal infallibility to have a church that runs fine. Look at the Old Testament Jews. Now, The Jews made lots of mistakes, they had lots of problems, but they were still God's people during all that time. And God was able to have a people without having to have infallibility in a single unitary leader throughout all their history. It's not necessary for God. And so when we saw the exposition of Luke 22 that Mr. Albert gave, where he said it must also refer to successors and that the head of the church needs this at all times, that's just not true. He doesn't need it at all times. God can preserve his church without it. He doesn't have to have a central unitary structure. And really, what gets to the bottom line of this whole debate, and I realize I'm wrapping up rather more quickly than I intended to, but what gets to the whole bottom of this is Vatican I asserts that God promised something. But when we ask to see where God promised it, what we're led around to something, well, here's somewhere God promised Peter some high responsibility in the church, and here's somewhere else where Peter is one of the leaders of the apostles, and here's somewhere else. But what about the papal infallibility? Does he ever promise him infallibility? Well, there's nowhere that he promises him infallibility. In Matthew 16, about binding and loosing, whatever he binds and looses is bound or loosed in heaven. If that's supposed to be the killer verse for papal infallibility, that's remarkable because it's so often been used for other purposes. And among those other purposes are the relationship between the confessor and the person confessing their sins. So he has the power to bind and loose those sins. That's one of the interpretations. But of course that doesn't imply infallibility. There's no claim that your local confessor priest will infallibly bind and loose you. It's, that kind of interpretation is a huge stretch. There's no basis in the text for it. And that's why if you even Porter, who apparently is some non-Roman Catholic exegete who Mr. Albert found some helpful comments in, he also doesn't come to that conclusion. And he doesn't imply that somehow Peter has infallibility in his office. And even if the passage should be read as asserting that Peter at some level has some manner of infallibility, there's an easy explanation in that Peter is an apostle. He has the prophetic gift. He writes scripture. He has 2 epistles that are among the scriptures, and he may have assisted one of the gospel writers. We don't know that for sure, but it's one of the traditions. There's so many other explanations besides papal infallibility. So the question really is Vatican I right? No, the Vatican I can't show that this is part of the deposit of the faith. There's no early church father that explicitly teaches this, and the arguments from implicit teaching have to do with arguing that, well, this guy said something really nice about Rome. Rome hasn't had doctrinal errors. It's preeminent. Paul even praised Rome during Paul's own lifetime, and he doesn't refer to Peter there. He doesn't refer to any Roman bishop there. And yet he talks about how they have they're admirable, they have great qualities. There's lots of nice things about early Rome, and one reason that they're praiseworthy is because they have visitors from all over the world coming in, and they can compare doctrines. They don't have to say, well, this is what we've been taught here forever. They can ask someone else, well, you were under the Apostle Andrew, what did you hear? But of course, those times are gone. There's no longer an overflow of people who have talked to the apostles in other cities and are now coming to Rome. Those times are long gone. That time period was a wonderful time period, no doubt. And when some of the early fathers praise Rome for their purity for faith, their resistance to persecution, and so forth, that's wonderful. We should rejoice. That church, the church of that era, which never claimed papal infallibility in those early years, that was a wonderful church. But the Church of Rome today, which arrogates itself to assert that the Pope is infallible, and to actually say that this is something that was received from the apostles, and that's what Vatican I says. It claims that it got these handed down as part of the deposit of faith. There's no claim to new revelation. That's just an unsupportable claim. And I hope that the careful reader will go through, investigate the claims. You can learn about the power grabs that were obtained through the use of these forged documents, but that's not the issue of infallibility. That's a completely separate issue. Very interesting one, but it's not papal infallibility. And With that, I thank Mr. Albeck for his time. I've been very aggressive in protecting my own time, but I appreciate his cooperation. And that concludes my statements.